The mysterious city of Machu Picchu is no longer occupied. It's been empty for nearly half a millennium.
You began to see within this the outline of a doorway.
Machu Picchu is the most impressive living testimony of Inca civilization.
It's absolutely breathtaking.
And we're talking about ultimately being able to recover the power that Pachacutec possessed.
There is something beneath Machu Picchu that was never meant to be found, not by tourists, not by historians, not by archaeologists, with permits and cameras and neatly labeled excavation grids. For roughly 500 years, it stayed hidden under the terraces, beneath the temples, below the postcard panorama that millions of people photograph every year without ever realizing how much of the site is still invisible. And then, between 2023 and 2025, 3 separate teams of researchers, working in 3 completely different fields, stumbled into the same story from 3 different directions. One team was extracting ancient DNA, another was scanning the mountain with LiDAR, a third was analyzing deep geological patterns from satellite data. None of them set out to expose a buried secret. None of them were trying to overturn the accepted history of Machu Picchu, but together, almost by accident, they triggered a chain reaction of discoveries that changed the way this place had to be understood. Because what they found was not simply older than expected, or larger than expected, or more complex than expected. It was something that should not exist at all. And that is where this story stops being an archaeological mystery and starts becoming something darker. Within weeks of those findings becoming public, the Peruvian government made a move that makes very little sense, unless what lies beneath Machu Picchu is worth more hidden than studied, more profitable obscured than explained. This is the discovery no one saw coming. And the closer you follow the timeline, the harder it becomes to believe that what happened next was a coincidence. To understand what may be buried beneath Machu Picchu, you have to begin 1 year earlier, in a genetics lab at Yale, where a bioarchaeologist named Dr. Lucy Salazar received a set of results so strange that she called a colleague in the middle of the night, rather than wait until morning. For months, Salazar and geneticist Dr. Richard Berger had been working on what was supposed to be a fairly straightforward project. Their team was extracting and sequencing DNA from the remains of 34 individuals buried within the walls of Machu Picchu. These were not anonymous fragments scattered in rubble or random bones pulled from disturbed soil. These were carefully placed burials located in deliberate positions throughout the citadel, interments that had been made over long stretches of time and preserved with unusual care. The working assumption behind the study was simple. Most scholars still treated Machu Picchu as a royal estate associated with the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, a kind of secluded mountain retreat tied to imperial ceremony, elite residence, and dynastic prestige. The DNA project was expected to refine that picture, not destroy it. At most, researchers thought they might find a predictable mix of attendants, retainers, priests, and local service populations linked to a royal center in the high Andes. But the data refused to fit that model. Instead of a relatively narrow population drawn from the surrounding highlands, the 34 individuals revealed a level of diversity that no one on the team had expected. Their genetic profiles did not cluster in the familiar way associated with standard Andean populations. They pointed to multiple backgrounds, multiple regions, multiple communities. Some carried markers more closely associated with coastal groups far to the west. Others showed connections stretching northward. This was not the genetic footprint of a quiet royal retreat inhabited by a stable local population. It looked more like a deliberately assembled human network drawn from across an empire. Then came the discovery that stopped everyone cold. 6 of the women buried at Machu Picchu carried DNA tracing not to the Andes at all, but to the Amazon rainforest. That detail is easy to say quickly, but it becomes much stranger the moment you slow down and picture it. These were lowland jungle lineages, found at roughly 2,440 meters above sea level, in a mountaintop citadel, long described as a highland royal center. The distance between the Amazon basin and Machu Picchu is not just geographic, it is punishing. You begin in suffocating heat and heavy jungle air, then move through dense forest, then steep cloud forest, then into harsh mountain passes where the temperature can drop dramatically in a single day, and the air thins until every step becomes work. Even today, people equipped with modern gear and mapped routes can die trying to cross terrain like that. And yet, 5 centuries ago, these women made that journey. Or they were made to make it. One pair in particular unsettled Salazar's team more than any other. A mother and daughter had been buried near one another, their relationship confirmed genetically. But when researchers looked at isotopes preserved in their bones, the chemistry told two different stories. The mother had spent her life in one environment, consuming the foods, water, and air signatures of one region. The daughter's chemical profile pointed elsewhere. Same bloodline, different landscapes, different diets, different water sources, different worlds. And then, somehow, both ended up at Machu Picchu. Together in death, at a site that was never supposed to raise questions like this. Salazar reportedly sat with those results for a long time before she wrote anything down, because what they implied was far more difficult to explain than ordinary migration. This did not look random. It did not look accidental. It looked deliberate. It looked like people were being moved across enormous distances and placed at Machu Picchu for reasons no one had properly understood. That raises a brutally simple question, and it is one the official story has never answered. Why were Amazonian women brought to a mountain citadel in the clouds? What role did they serve? And if Machu Picchu was really just a royal estate or ceremonial retreat, why do the people buried there look less like a local court and more like a carefully assembled population drawn from different corners of the empire? That alone would have been enough to shake the accepted picture. But while Salazar and Berger were studying bones in New Haven, another team was already looking down on Machu Picchu from the sky, and what they found made the DNA study feel like the opening move. In 2024, remote sensing specialist Ari Karamanica and a team using LiDAR-equipped drones flew over sections of Machu Picchu that tourists never see and that most researchers had not been permitted to explore in any systematic way. LiDAR is not ordinary aerial photography. It fires millions of laser pulses at the terrain and uses their returns to build detailed three-dimensional models of the landscape beneath vegetation, shallow soil, and surface clutter. In effect, it peels the jungle away and reveals the geometry hiding underneath. The drones passed over densely forested slopes surrounding the famous terraces and temples, areas that had long been treated as natural wilderness, scenic margins surrounding the known archaeological core. On paper, these zones were little more than untouched jungle framing a monumental site. That was the assumption. The lasers disagreed. 12 previously unknown structures appeared in the data. 12 buildings or platforms, hidden under centuries of vegetation, never mapped in any publicly recognized survey, never incorporated into the accepted plan of Machu Picchu. Despite centuries of awareness and more than 100 years of modern archaeological attention, some of the anomalies resembled ceremonial platforms, others appeared residential or administrative. At that stage, exact function mattered less than the larger implication. They were there, they had always been there, and almost nobody had been allowed to look closely enough to notice them. That is where the story starts to become uncomfortable. The sectors where these structures were detected were not normal public areas. They were restricted zones. Tourists did not go there. Most researchers did not go there. For decades, these sections had been controlled and limited, with very little public explanation for why systematic scanning had not been treated as a priority. Yet the moment someone finally looked with the right technology, hidden architecture began surfacing almost immediately. 12 structures, concealed for 5 centuries, found in weeks, in sectors that had remained effectively sealed. If those structures were hiding just outside the visible core of Machu Picchu, then how large was the real complex? Were we actually looking at a single mountaintop citadel? Or were we looking at the visible center of something much larger, most of it still uncounted and buried beneath vegetation, soil, and official boundaries? That question might have remained speculative if the next discovery had not made it far harder to dismiss. In 2025, geologist Dr. Rualdo Menegat, working out of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, was analyzing geological and satellite data beneath Machu Picchu when he noticed something so improbable that he reran the models repeatedly before he trusted it. 2 major fault systems, each stretching for roughly 175 kilometers, passed directly beneath the site. Not somewhere nearby, not in the wider region, directly beneath it. And where they cross, they form an X whose intersection lies almost exactly under the main temple complex. At first glance, that sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. Fault lines are supposed to mean instability, fracture, collapse, seismic danger. But when Menegat and his team ran simulations across more than 1,000 earthquake scenarios, varying magnitude, direction, and stress behavior, the same result emerged again and again. That intersection point was not unusually dangerous. It was unusually stable. The opposing tectonic forces worked against one another in a way that reduced movement at the crossing, effectively creating a geological sweet spot. In other words, the Inca appear to have built Machu Picchu on the most earthquake-resistant point in the entire area. That is the sort of claim that sounds exaggerated until you realize what it implies. We needed satellite data, advanced modeling, and modern computational analysis to isolate that point in the 21st century. The Inca found it in the 15th. They found it without any documented instruments that should have made such a choice possible, without modern geological theory, and without written technical manuals explaining how they selected the site. Cusco has been repeatedly devastated by earthquakes. Colonial districts collapsed, churches crumbled, entire neighborhoods were flattened. Machu Picchu still stands. Not as a romantic ruin saved by luck, but as a structure whose endurance appears tied to a level of site selection so precise that it still embarrasses modern assumptions. So either the Inca made an impossibly fortunate guess, choosing the one perfect mountain location out of countless possible places by blind luck, or they knew something about the ground beneath their feet that we are only now learning how to measure. And when Menegat published that finding, there was no meaningful public response, no serious national celebration, no visible official engagement, just silence. The same silence that met the DNA results. The same silence that met the LiDAR structures. The same silence that begins to feel less like caution and more like avoidance. Because the geological revelation connected directly to something engineers had already been documenting for years, something that most visitors to Machu Picchu never fully realize while they are standing on top of it. What tourists see is only part of the site. When modern engineers and archaeologists began studying Machu Picchu's construction in detail, they reached a conclusion that still has not fully entered public consciousness. The terraces, temples, staircases, fountains, and stone walls that appear in every postcard may account for only about 40% of the actual engineering. The rest is underground. By some estimates, more than 60% of Machu Picchu exists beneath the visible surface. That is not a metaphor. It is an infrastructure problem on the scale of a hidden city. Beneath the terraces are deep foundation layers, retaining systems, drainage channels, carefully graded gravel beds, subterranean waterworks, and massive structural networks built to stabilize the mountain and control the movement of water through it. When excavation teams dug below the terraces, they found that the visible city was sitting on top of a buried system far more extensive than most people imagined. The terraces tourists admire are not merely agricultural platforms or scenic steps cut into a mountain. They are the exposed upper edge of a much larger engineering solution. The drainage alone is enough to change how you think about the site. Water entering high on the mountain is guided through stone-lined conduits, filtered through multiple layers of carefully graded material, redistributed across different levels, and discharged at lower points in controlled flows. The system prevents pooling, it reduces erosion, it protects slope integrity, it keeps the mountain from destroying the city built into it, and it has done that for centuries through heavy rains, earthquakes, abandonment, and neglect. That is not picturesque. That is genius, hidden under scenery. The most unsettling part is that it still works. At this very moment, while visitors line up at the overlook and tour buses grind through the valley below, ancient Inca drainage systems are still managing rainfall on a mountain in Peru, with a level of efficiency that many modern urban systems fail to match. Engineers who have studied the site have said the infrastructure rivals modern civil works. Some go further than that. And even underground, the precision does not end. At the highest point of Machu Picchu sits the Intihuatana, a carved granite pillar whose name is usually translated as the place where the sun is tied. For years, it was often described in fairly soft terms as a ceremonial object, a ritual stone, symbolically important but not necessarily functional. Then someone decided to measure it properly. Using GPS-based precision mapping, researchers found that one of its principal lines sits within roughly 3 degrees of true north. Not magnetic north, which drifts and shifts. True geographic north. More than that, the stone appears to function as a solar marker, tracking solstices and equinoxes with remarkable consistency. Depending on how the measurements are interpreted, its seasonal alignments remain accurate to within minutes. Year after year, century after century. No recalibration, no moving parts, no correction. That kind of astronomical control is very difficult to dismiss as decorative coincidence. It suggests a site where topography, geology, hydraulics, celestial observation, and political movement may all have been integrated into a single design logic. So, hold the full picture in your head for a moment. A mountaintop complex built on a nearly perfect seismic sweet spot that modern science only recently identified. A site whose visible architecture may represent less than half of its true engineering. Hidden structures emerging from restricted sectors once LiDAR is finally allowed to look. Genetic evidence showing that the people buried there were not a simple local elite, but a deliberately assembled population from across the empire, including women with Amazonian ancestry brought across some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. And above all of it, a carved stone aligned with a level of precision that still feels out of proportion to the tools history says were available. At some point, the obvious question becomes unavoidable. How much of Machu Picchu has actually been discovered? 10%? 20%? Enough to market, preserve, and photograph, but not enough to understand? What else is still buried under that mountain? What sits inside those restricted sectors? What lies beneath the visible terraces and foundations that tourists treat as the whole site simply because that is the part they are allowed to see? If you are connecting the same dots the researchers were beginning to connect, then you already know this story becomes more troubling the moment you move from discovery to timing. Because what happened next is not the discovery itself, it is the response. In January 2026, Peru's Ministry of Culture approved a master plan for the protection of Machu Picchu. On paper, it looked like exactly what scientists, conservationists, and archaeologists had been asking for. The plan described preservation goals, visitor management, conservation strategies, and long-term stewardship stretching to 2046. It sounded careful. It sounded responsible. It sounded like the state finally understood the scale and fragility of what Machu Picchu really is. 3 weeks later, that same government greenlit the Chinchero International Airport project. 3 weeks. From protection to expansion. From stewardship to acceleration. From caution on paper to a decision that would push tourism into the valley at levels the region may not be able to survive. The airport project itself was not new. Versions of it had existed for years, then stalled, then become entangled in corruption scandals and construction controversies linked to wider regional networks of bribery and infrastructure contracts. For a long time, it seemed politically toxic, too compromised to revive quickly. And then, suddenly, in early 2026, it did not merely return. It was fast-tracked. The operational target moved toward late 2027. Visitor projections rose to roughly 8 million per year, far above current levels, pushed through a valley already under pressure from infrastructure, water, transport, and waste limitations. That number matters. 8 million tourists a year is not just a line in a development document. It means roads, buses, hotels, runoff, construction, vibration, pressure, moisture, waste, traffic, new service networks, and all of it directed toward a mountain city whose visible stonework is only part of the system keeping the whole site alive. And there is another detail that should stop you cold. The official capacity study, the report meant to determine whether the region can sustainably absorb this level of development, was not due until September 2026, months after the airport approval. In other words, the project was approved before the study that was supposed to determine whether it should exist at all. That is backward, in a way that is hard to explain as ordinary bureaucracy. If the report arrives after the decision, then the report is not guiding policy. It is following it. By that point, the logic is already done. The money is already moving. The timeline is already in motion. And the scientists were not quiet about what this could mean. Researchers connected to the DNA studies, LiDAR work, engineering analysis, and broader archaeological institutions warned that mass tourism expansion on this scale posed direct risks, not only to the visible architecture, but to the underground systems that make the site stable in the first place. Increased foot traffic, vibration, drainage pressure, construction activity, and ecological strain do not threaten only the postcard view. They threaten the buried infrastructure that has survived for 5 centuries, precisely because it was never designed to absorb industrial-scale tourism. Peru's official response to those warnings was not a detailed rebuttal. It was not a public debate over the science. It was silence. Again, one side had peer-reviewed studies, ancient DNA, LiDAR mapping, geological modeling, engineering documentation, and centuries of structural proof. The other side had projected revenue, construction timelines, and a runway. And this is where the timeline begins to feel wrong in a way that is difficult to ignore. For 15 years, the airport project drifted in and out of political ruin. Then, after a cluster of discoveries revealed that Machu Picchu may be far larger, more complex, more fragile, and more significant than previously understood, the project suddenly became urgent. Not in a distant planning sense. Urgent now, urgent enough to move quickly, before the valley could fully digest what the science was starting to reveal. That does not prove a conspiracy. It does not need to. The timeline is unsettling on its own. A genetic study shatters the neat royal retreat narrative and reveals a deliberately assembled, multi-ethnic burial population from across an empire. Silence. LiDAR uncovers 12 hidden structures in sectors that had remained restricted for decades. Silence. Geological modeling shows the site was built on an astonishingly stable seismic intersection we only now know how to identify. Silence. Engineers remind everyone that most of Machu Picchu is underground and that its hidden systems are the real reason it has survived. Silence. Then, 3 weeks after signing a 20-year protection plan, the bulldozers get a green light. So the question becomes difficult to avoid. What if this is not really about tourism at all? What if the timing only makes sense when you factor in what these discoveries threaten? What if the problem is not merely that Machu Picchu is fragile, but that new science is starting to reveal a version of the site that cannot be controlled as easily once the world sees it clearly? What if what lies underground, or inside those restricted sectors, or beneath the visible footprint of the city, is more valuable to certain people as an asset than as a scientific truth? I am not saying that explains everything. I am saying the sequence of events is hard to read any other way without at least feeling the weight of that possibility. Because now we are left with an impossible city built on an invisible geological X, with more than half of its true engineering still hidden under the mountain, with hidden structures surfacing the moment the right tools are used, with a burial record that makes the old royal retreat theory look painfully incomplete, and with a government response that grows more aggressive, precisely as the science grows more unsettling. Machu Picchu is no longer just a spectacular ruin in the clouds. It is starting to look like the exposed tip of something much larger, much more deliberate, and much less understood than history was prepared to admit. And time may be running out. Because once modern development accelerates through that valley, once traffic, construction, pressure, and commercialization overwhelm the site's margins, whatever is still buried there may not be uncovered carefully. It may be damaged, sealed off, paved around, or quietly rendered inaccessible before it can be properly studied at all. That is what makes this story feel urgent. Not only the possibility that Machu Picchu is far bigger than we thought, or stranger than we thought, or engineered at a level we still struggle to explain, but the possibility that we are learning all of this at the exact moment when the conditions for real discovery are being squeezed by money, speed, and political convenience. Something lies beneath that mountain. The science keeps pointing downward, and every new layer makes the official story feel smaller. The question is not whether Machu Picchu still has secrets. The question is how much longer those secrets will remain accessible before the window closes. Because if the last few years have shown us anything, it is that we have not reached the bottom of this site. Not even close. The mountain is still holding back most of what it knows. And whatever is buried beneath the terraces, the temples, the hidden sectors, and the visible city may be the very reason the timeline around Machu Picchu no longer makes sense. The countdown is already underway. And the impossible city in the clouds, with more than half its reality still buried in darkness, may be running out of time before the world understands what it truly is.